Hello, everybody. I am so grateful to be here. I'm really grateful for the young lady that just spoke. Nira has been a force in my life from the time that we were both in our 20s. She is still in her 20s. I, however, am quickly aging out of my 40s. But I'm excited for us, this gathering here, and I'm excited for it because it's a gathering of ideas, for us to talk about facts, for us to talk about what works. I was a mayor of a city, which is a very pragmatic, tactical, strategic job where you don't really have time often to discuss larger philosophical issues. You're trying to fix stuff and get things done. I used to have this saying when I was mayor, in God we trust, but everybody else bring me data. I wanted to look at the numbers, what worked. And it gave me a searing view into not only what was good about America, but the unfinished business that our country had not achieved. And I want to tell you this, my father, who died 6 days before I came to the United States Senate, who filled me with a love of this country. Here's a man that saw the most vicious instances of segregation, of violence, civil rights movement, and the activism he was involved in. But yet he loved this country because he believed in the ideals of this country. Ideals I could speak about in front of any audience, that we all believe in our common aspirations. Ideas like this is a nation where every generation should do better than the one before. All of us, I don't care who you are in this room, whether you're a first-generation American immigrant or whether you're someone like me who, thanks to Skip Gates, can trace my history back to the 1640s in this country. We all come from humble roots. Indentured servants and slaves, farmers and factory workers, domestics, janitors. These are all jobs, many of which were in my family. And my father and my grandfather, my parents and grandparents, and even great-grandmother used to preach the gospel of America, which is as true for an urban New Jersey kid as it is for a rural kid in the South, that we are the country of liberty and justice. We are a nation, that the very idea of the American dream is the idea of expanding opportunity, expanding possibilities. And my dad benefited from this. A guy who went from a boy working in a funeral home back in the days where it was segregated, carrying black bodies because white funeral homes wouldn't touch them. A guy who got opportunities in this country to go to college, serve in the military, to advance his career in this city because of activism, to become the first African American hired by IBM as a salesman in the entire region. The booming 60s and 70s and 80s that brought the biggest explosion of middle class on the planet Earth at the time. From my mother's side of the family, poor agricultural workers, farmers who moves up to big cities like Detroit to get opportunity. My grandfather working on a factory assembly line for Ford. All of these stories are our stories. And the most haunting thing, though, that my dad says to me before he dies was when I was living for about a decade. I lived in these high-rise projects in the neighborhood I still live in, this inner-city community. My father, after a horrible, violent gun incident, looks at me and he says, "Son, I worry that a child born like me in America, poor, black, to a single mom, in a segregated world would do better than a kid being born under the same circumstances today. Poor, being born poor, black to a single mother." Well, my worry is, and my frustration is, you don't even need to use race as one of the lenses. You just look at the difference between this country's promise in my father's generation and now. Now look, I look at the data. I don't want to be born in a time of segregation when lynchings were still happening across this country, but if you look at data, if you look at the measures that matter, you begin to question about what has happened in the span of my lifetime to the promise of America, to the ideals of America, to the things that matter. As mayor, I created these intricate dashboards to measure the progress of my city. I'm so proud of what's happening in Newark right now. And according to the numbers, from college, high school graduation rates going up 20% to the biggest economic development period in our city's last 60 years, to even we were one of the most underparked cities in America and measuring the acres, dozens of we created. But here I get to Washington and I'm a competitor. Now I'm looking at all of New Jersey and I'm looking at all of America, and what are the data that matters? Well, I found this one indice for the World Economic Forum that in me as a competitor really got my blood boiling. In my dad's generation, we were the number one on all the indices that matter, indices of competitiveness of economies. But in just the span of my lifetime, we've gone to number one on all the indices. In fact, even the overall spot, the most economically competitive country in the planet Earth used to be America. We've fallen out of the top one, top two to top three. And if you go to the other indices, everyone here, I don't care what your political background is, should be upset. What are some of those indices that they look at? They look at things like R&D intensivity, how much we invest in the ideas of the future. We in this room are drafting off of the investments that were made in R&D. We were the number one country in investing in future ideas, from the NIH to DARPA. We made, in fact, pull out your smartphone, from the battery life to the touch screen to the GPS, are all of our collective dollars, public and private. Many economies are increasing their intensivity relative to GDP, but we no longer are even in the top 10 in percentage of GDP. Think about infrastructure. We were the number one infrastructure country on the planet Earth. We literally had Republicans and Democrats joining together. The Eisenhower Highway Act, with equivalent of $1 trillion today, invested in our infrastructure, created thousands and thousands of jobs. And I know this from living in New Jersey. When you're choked by an inadequate infrastructure, you lose billions of dollars in productivity. Well, we set the stage as on the planet Earth for what it means to develop your infrastructure. Where are we now? Not even in the top 10. And it's embarrassing to me when I travel around the world to talk with world leaders whose ports are more efficient than ours, whose broadband penetration is better than ours, whose trains run faster than ours. I was just talking to my staff about the data on the trains along the Northeast Corridor. We're moving in the wrong direction. Other countries are breaking records for the moving of their trains. Here we are in this country, and we literally, from the Northeast Corridor coming down to DC, you moved a half an hour faster in the 1960s. You literally can move an hour faster if you go back to the 1940s from Vermont to New York. This should get all of our, I don't care what your political background is, what your philosophy, this should get us upset. But how about this? This moral mission that our country believed in, that every single person has worth, has value, that if you invest in the genius, which is the greatest natural resource any country has, the genius of their children. In a global knowledge-based society, that is true. And we declared with our great public education systems, the greatest public colleges on the planet Earth at the time, that we would be the education nation. And it's not just a moral mission, but we understand how this directly affects the productivity of a populace. Well, we used to be the number one in high school graduation, college graduation, percentage of population. We're out of the top 10 now. I could go on. The data screams out about what other countries are doing that we used to do in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to build out this nation. It's like we inherited this incredible house from our parents and we trashed it. And now we're about to pass on an infrastructure, about $3 trillion of infrastructure debt to our children. And other countries are trying to not only do what we did and try to out-America us, but they're actually trying to do it better. Other countries now are racing towards early childhood education. We're one of the few industrialized countries that doesn't have universal early childhood. They believe in things knowing how critical a child's earliest years are, and they have things like paid family leave. Other nations are realizing that we need to lower barriers to access to education. Germany, 0 to 4% of median income to go to college. Canada, 7%. Canadians. Here in the United States, blame Canada. Here in the United States, it's 52% of median income. Other countries are realizing that they need to make those investments. A Pell Grant used to cover 80% of the cost of going to college. Now it covers just 30%. And we don't even allow those things to extend to apprenticeships. I am so frustrated on the obvious changes going on between my dad's era and now, but there are other things we don't talk about enough. We've created in my father's era with just the thought, I remember talking to my grandfather about what it meant to get a job at a factory, at Ford Motor Plant, the dignity of work. Well, in one generation, we've destroyed that dignity of work, one, by commoditizing workers. We now live in a country where just the minimum wage in my dad's era would be the equivalent of about $12 an hour now. Now we have in American workers 40 million that make less than that. We now have a nation that this idea of short-termism in our economy is changing the very nature of business enterprises. Listen to this, according to a survey of about 80% of the CFOs of 400 of America's largest public companies, they admit in the survey that they would sacrifice a firm's economic value to meet the next quarter's earnings. We're seeing the investment of our companies, and companies is one of my favorite business books, is entitled that We're Built to Last, and now companies are designed just to try to up the next quarter's earnings. And this is coming from an activism and a pressure on Wall Street where the average stock holding used to be for the long term, 8 years in my dad's era, now is measured in 8 months. And having firms do things of not investing in workers and training, but just investing in stock buybacks. Between 2003 and 2012, S&P 500 companies spent 91% of their earnings on buybacks and dividends. Compare that to private companies. Over the last 20 years, private companies have spent twice as much on public companies as a percentage of their overall revenue on things like worker training, building new factories and investing in infrastructure, investing in R&D and the ideas of the future. And what this is doing is it's creating a lack of dignity in work, and to have an economy that, not like Adam Smith imagined in Moral Sentiments, where the economic system is not the end, it is a manner to produce great moral outcomes for our country. What that's produced, unfortunately, is this terrible practices that continue to suppress workers' wages in this country. I told you, I live in an inner city community. I'm the only senator that lives in a community where the median income, according to the last census, is $14,000 per household. My neighbors, my residents are incredible folk who work hard as anything. In fact, I would argue they're working harder than many of their parents did, but they're making less money. New York Times did this great article comparing a janitor that worked for Kodak versus a janitor that now works for Apple. This new thing that's going on, which is just outsourcing, where companies are now outsourcing basic functions. That janitor that worked for Kodak was a worker, actually an employee of Kodak. They followed this worker who could participate in the benefits programs, the tuition reimbursement, and move themselves up. They were the American dream into middle management, into the middle class. Well, that janitor that works for Apple doesn't work for Apple. They work for these outsourced companies. I see my residents, my neighbors, getting up, working full-time jobs, catching extra shifts, finding things to do on the workout and to hustle for money, and they still rely on public benefits. They still rely on affordable housing and Section 8 vouchers. They still rely on SNAP benefits. This makes no sense whatsoever in a country that was founded on this ideal that if you're willing to work hard and play by the rules, that you'll get ahead. But more than that, it's having a sinister effect on what's happening in our country. And I say that because I witnessed this. If you are a baby boomer, my dad's generation, 90% of baby boomers, 90% did better than their parents at the same time. Now in this generation with millennials, it's a coin toss, 50-50. And in certain communities, you're seeing that those numbers get worse. Millennials on a whole are making about 20% less than their parents did at the same age. Nearly half of all workers make less than $15 an hour now. That's about $30,000 per year, and it's not enough to live in my metropolitan area. We are a nation that doesn't understand that the toxicity of what we have allowed to happen in just 4+ decades is actually not just morally wrong, but is financially killing our country as a whole. Take, for example, the moral sin of poverty, something that the Bible talks about so much more than a lot of the other issues that seem to be talked about when we're talking about religion. And I'm one of those people that believes before you tell me about your religion, first show it to me in how you treat other people. You want to see the truth of a country? You want to see the truth of a country? Go to the prisons in a nation. I'm one of those guys, I want to stand with those people who are deplored. I want to stand with those people who are disrespected and degraded in a society. I want to stand up for them. I want to stand with them. Go to other countries and see who they put in prison. We have nations that put the press in prison. There are dozens of people in prison, places like Turkey, for things like fake news. In other countries, they lock up political opponents. Even though we were yelling, lock her up, the reality is we don't do that here. Other countries do. Other countries oppress religious minorities and put them in prison. But hey, who does the United States, this moral nation, who do we imprison? We imprison overwhelmingly the poor. As Brian Stevenson says, we have a nation that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than poor and innocent. Poverty is a crime in this country. I watched growing up in an affluent neighborhood how my friends did just the same kind of knucklehead stuff that teenagers do in every type of community, but you get a pass for that. In my community, I always say marijuana is legal in America if you're privileged. If you're at Stanford. But in my community, you see who we put in prison. And that has a cascading effect of poverty. Vanderbilt University says we'd have 20% less poverty in America if our incarceration rates were same as our industrial peers, because while other nations were building out their infrastructure, we in the United States, the only infrastructure we were building were prisons, a new one every 10 days between the time I was in law school with Nira and the time I was mayor of Newark. Crushing communities where police actions are concentrated, more marijuana arrests last year than violent crime arrests, and forcing poverty rates in our nation. We literally have the highest child poverty rate of industrialized countries. But listen to this. Recent analysis estimated that the total cost of child poverty in the United States is $1 trillion, due largely to the loss of economic productivity in our country that comes with children who are growing up in the toxic stress of poverty. Evidence from just SNAP, the evidence they collect with SNAP, I see this. I'm one of those senators, when I shop at my local bodega, I see people using food stamps. And I know what happens at the end of the month versus the beginning of the month when suddenly people have money. Go shopping in my neighborhood at the beginning of a month when people have money and you see our supermarkets full. Well, at the end of the month, guess what happens to kids? Disciplinary actions go up, hospital visits go up, test scores go down at the end of the month as benefits run out. More than 1 in 5 kids are born in poverty, as I said, and we do little about it, despite the fact that growing up in poverty leads to chronic stress, leads into toxic developing brains and negative impacts. Folks, if this is our most valuable natural resource, how are we treating it? I can argue all day the moral issues, but the economic issues as well are so compelling. Early childhood education, we know with the balance sheet analysis, the evidence is clear. This is data. Expanding early childhood learning would provide the social benefits of roughly $8.60 for every dollar we spend in that early childhood education. Apprenticeship programs, which are underfunded, Germany, Switzerland, kicking our tails in apprenticeship expansion, we don't do it. Even though studies have shown that people who compete registered apprenticeship programs earn over $250,000 more in their careers than people did that don't participate in those programs. This can go on and on and on. Preventative care, I've seen what the expansion of access to care did in my own city. Hospital emergency rooms went down, visits went down. In fact, New Jersey as a whole, just by expanding access to health care, preventative care, lowered our charity care costs in our state $500 million. This is a balance sheet analysis. R&D investments, one of the best things we can do. Infrastructure investments in terms of increasing productivity. We can go on and on and on. The minimum wage alone, a $12 raising in the minimum wage, just raising the minimum wage to $12 would cut SNAP costs to us by $53 billion less in food stamps. And this is the cost of letting people go hungry, which we do not understand what it means. to have food insecurity in this country, which affects millions and millions of people. I am angry and agitated because I have watched my generation take the torch from the greatest generation, take the torch from the civil rights generation, and now what are we going to hand off to millennials and Generation Z when it comes to American greatness? To America showing the world what the land of opportunity is about, what the American dream is about. Heck, now, if you were in heaven, thinking about where to be born poor on the planet Earth in a generation past, you would pick America. But now this is not the best country to do it. And I'm here to tell you that this isn't a fait accompli. This is not something that we have nothing to do about, but it's, will we dream about a greatness again? We have such talent and such worth on this nation, but we're keeping so many people on the sidelines. Not just tens of millions of poor kids, but people who are ready to work. When a new business, small business opens up, or even a fast food restaurant, we have lines. When an Applebee opened up in Newark, right up Springfield Avenue, around the corner where I live, we had lines around the building of people who want to work because they know what a job, even a minimum wage job, means to the security of their family. If we are to be a great nation, we have to start looking at the numbers. What we all agree on are indices of true excellence, and begin to commit ourselves to doing those things because of the moral reason, but also because of the balance sheet analysis. And so I'm in this fight because I go home at the end of this week to Newark. I'll stand in the neighborhood where my dad stood. Shahad Smith, who just got murdered on my street by an assault weapon weeks ago. I don't only look at that as a moral tragedy, but if we were adding up the numbers, Chicago alone, just on the medical treatment of gunshot wounds, almost $500 million. And we're not doing common sense things that will save money, not to mention the trauma. My friend who works at the IHOP, she has a son that has asthma. She literally couldn't leave to go to the hospital to visit her son in bed because she would have to give up her paycheck, no paid family leave. When the gunshot happened in front of her IHOP, she survives on $2.13 an hour plus tips. Guess what? It shocks a community and businesses go down. This makes no economic sense, not to mention moral sense. And so this is an idea festival, and I was taught at an early age, don't curse the darkness, but light a candle. Some of the playbook here we wrote. I can't believe I have arguments over environmental justice issues when I can show you the economic impact. When you have wild, rampant corporate consolidation in the agricultural sector, it not only hollows out Midwestern communities, it not only drives, literally standing in North Carolina in Duplin County, looking at the almost sharecropper lifestyle of people who take care of pigs, but then it pollutes rivers in these massive CAFOs, stealing the wealth of communities, land values going down. This is not rocket scientists. We know what a free market really should be about and how we've perverted it in everything that we see changing from just a generation ago. And so I want to give you all hope. But Democrats and Republicans used to get together. We used to do things and make investments in the number one valuable resource we have, which is each other. My grandfather was able to get his family out of poverty because Gerald Ford had this belief that capitalism had a responsibility. He said, I want to pay the people on my assembly lines enough money so they can afford the cars that they're making. And now I have people in my community who work in restaurants and literally have to live on food stamps because they cannot afford the food that they're serving. And so a lot of this is common sense. If the minimum wage just kept up with inflation, it'd be almost $12 an hour. We need to raise the minimum wage. If we are a nation that believed in investing in things that have a multiplier effect in our economy, investing in infrastructure programs, investing in early child education, investing in research and development, That's the best use of taxpayer dollars because it grows the hole. Unlike this toxic tax bill that blows a hole in our deficit, driving money up that is often benefiting, not even, if you see what we're doing with so much of these profits that corporations are getting, stock buybacks, which benefit stockholders, a third of them are outside of our country. I believe we have the ideas to make the change, but what we're lacking is a commitment, the moral sense of urgency, that the fabric of our communities are hurting. And I'm not just talking about inner city Newark. I've had the privilege now of traveling to Midwestern communities, traveling to the rural South, traveling out West. I've read books like Hillbilly Elegy and everything I can to try to understand other folks. And when I'm reading books like that, I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, these folks have so much in common with folks that live in my neighborhood. We in this country have a common pain, but we are lacking a sense of common purpose that drove this country forward generation after generation, and that's what I am calling for us to do. To start doing the common sense policies, embracing big ideas like the presidents that talked about highways stretching throughout the country or talked about investments in research and education that would get us to the moon. This is the calling of our country right now. I found common sense ways to get some things done that I'm proud of. An Opportunity Investment Act I did with Tim Scott, the other big bald guy in the Senate, that says, hey, we're going to create tax incentives to invest in the emerging markets in America, the poorest areas, because we're suffering as a country from VC dollars being overwhelmingly dominated in 3 metropolitan areas. I'm working across the aisle trying to say, how can we have VC dollars only going to overwhelmingly white men when genius and ideas exist in women and minority communities? I proposed a federal jobs guarantee, which is not a radical new idea, from Martin Luther King to FDR, this idea that instead of paying on the back end of a problem with billions and billions of dollars, food stamp, TANF, housing vouchers, why not invest on the front end with secure jobs so you're not seeing the negative impacts that come with low employment or underemployment, like loss of housing, evictions, foreclosures. I've pulled together with other senators and talked about just the understanding that we've got to get out of these false debates, like expanding health care. Literally, we debated about a month ago the CHIP program, the Child Health Insurance Program, when the CBO even said, look at the balance sheet. The more you expand this program, the more taxpayer dollars you even save. And so this is how I want to end. 50 years ago, Martin Luther King grew in frustration about integration, not that we weren't achieving it, but he bemoaned publicly, what's the sense of being able to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford to buy what's on the menu? He knew that the test of this nation wouldn't be the size of our buildings, the amount of billionaires we have, and there's nothing wrong with those things, but he knew that the test of this nation was how we dealt with people that were in poverty. And 50 years ago, right after King was assassinated, the idea that he had and others was the Poor People's Campaign. And it wasn't some kind of class revolution. It wasn't some kind of trying to pit one group of Americans against another. If you read the documents of that Poor Person's Campaign, they were calling to the idea of America, the very dream of our nation, that we would be a place where we understood in a free society that freedom from poverty, freedom from health insecurity, freedom from substandard housing was as important as the freedoms to cultivate your genius, the freedom to nourishing the best of who you are. And if you read the documents of that Poor People's Campaign, they call upon all of those themes of America. And they understand the value and the worth and the dignity that is being wasted when you allow such poverty, such sin to proliferate. This is a time that we have to call to the best of who we are. And so I end with this poem. It's about being the truth of who we are, about bringing our country together again. It's about sharing those common values. It's about recognizing that common pain must produce a sense of common purpose again. And this is what Langston Hughes wrote. He said, "Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, but must be, the land where everyone is free, the poor man, the Indian, the Negro, me." And who made America? Whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain must make our mighty dream live again. Oh yes, I say it plain. America never was America to me, but I swear this oath, America will be. In this generation, in this moment, it is a moral moment. We are a great nation. We must again pledge ourselves to our principles and ideals, not just with words, not just with our hand over our hearts, but our hands at work in rekindling the flame and the light of America so that we're not lagging in the world on the measures that matter, but yet once again leading. Thank you.